Welcome to the monthly workshop, the CPR-CSH monthly workshop. We've been conducting this workshop for now almost 13 years every month. So it's really interesting how the number of historians presenting in our workshop has been growing. Actually, we've had a number in the last couple of years, especially during the COVID years, when I think we were able to expand our geographies and get in a lot of people because of the switch to the online format. So it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Bandyopadhyay from IISER Mohali to present his work on Kolkata, which is part of a book which has recently come out. And we hope that you'll also be able to tell us a little bit more about the book as a whole. And I understand that what you're presenting today is some part of the research and the ideas that you're proposing in the book. So I won't say more because we want to hear more from you. I'll hand over to you. As for the audience, please feel free to drop in your questions into the chat box or the question and answer box, as in when you think up of the questions. But once Ritajyoti finishes his talk, we will open the floor and we will sort of call you in to ask your questions directly. So on that note, let me hand over for this very exciting talk on Kolkata and city as territory. Spatializing Majoritarianism in 20th century Calcutta, which sounds quite a formidable topic, and I'm sure we'll delve into areas of interest, a mutual interest for all of us. Over to you.
Thank you, Mukta, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present some of the bits from my recently published book. You can see the book here. I see some great historians present as well. I see Janaki, I see So I start. Streets in Motion develops an approach to urban history. I'm first giving you a general introduction to the book and then going into the main topic, as you said. So Streets in Motion develops an approach to urban history by theorizing and historicizing the street that emerged in the context of the 19th century urban insurrections and evolved with and contributed to the 20th century automobile revolution and mass political culture. I worked at two registers, a local history of Calcutta in colonial and post-colonial periods, and a theorizing of the logistical and political cultural centrality of the street within this rubric. The street is the framing device of the book, through which I narrate Calcutta's 20th century and weave together stories of urban planning, property, accumulation, territoriality, mass political formation, communal riots, and popular encroachments. These stories demonstrate the many ways in which popular sovereignty materialized in space in the 20th century city. So materiality of popular sovereignty is the continuous thread in this book. To track the co-constitutive nature of the spatial and the political, I deploy a motion obstruction dialectic of the capitalist urban process. You can see the dialectic. I tried to build a diagram. I posit motion as a modular form of conditioning in the urban context, alluding to the ceaseless movement of capital, goods, labor, and information that animate urban life. I understand obstruction, on the other hand, as a domain of human agency and subjectivity in its modular form, a sphere where capital's law of motion is negotiated, punctuated, and refunctioned. In other words, through obstructions, the universality of motion acquires historical contingencies and meanings. Thus, obstructions give us access to more effective narratives of human belonging. Accessing motion through obstruction unmasks and hence denaturalizes motion and unravels social relations built it. In the bourgeois autobiography of capital, motion is also a painstakingly constructed ideology in the backdrop of imagined and real obstructions, while obstruction stands for capital's discursive other delinquents. Motion and obstruction are reciprocally interdependent, mutually determining, though there exists power disequilibrium between them. Obstructions are internal to and constitutive of motion. Motion and obstruction are not fixed elements, however, swinging across their opposites. A reasonable understanding would be that you embrace each within itself, these opposites, as immanent tendencies. Thus, the question of reversal is always already assumed in this logic. There is no reason to believe that motion is always and invariably a force from the above, that is capital and the state, and the obstructions are responses from below. The capitalist urban process is unconditioned relative to its constituents, motion and obstruction, since the whole, that is capitalist urban process, will not stand in relation to motion and obstruction as they stand in relation to each other. In the capitalist urban process, motion and obstruction are both preserved and annulled simultaneously. They are contained in the whole process only with their original senses being transformed. Motion and obstruction are internal to each other only insofar as they are elements of the capitalist urban process. In this presentation, I pick up one of the central themes of the book dealing with the emergence of Muslim minority ghettos in mid-20th century Calcutta. Urban histories of ghettoization, I claim, can be written through the dialectics of motion and obstruction. Throughout its colonial history, Calcutta had been a Hindu majority city in the heart of a Muslim majority province. Until the mid-20th century, despite bitter rivalry, the city's Hindu and Muslim populations inhabited shared spaces, even in areas populated chiefly by members of one community, creating a complex communal sharing of neighborhoods, infrastructures, and resources. Ghettos did not manifest to the extent they do today. However, the city's character began to transform slowly in the interwar decades due to the twin effects of urban renewal and communal mobilization, culminating in an utter territorial defeat of Muslims in the mid-20th century. As Calcutta was settled with the Hindu majority state of West Bengal in the Hindu majority Union of India. One of the outcomes of this was ghetto formation in the city's margins. While ghettoization is a violent process, ghettos are also kept in place through violence. This talk is not about ghettos per se. I'm not doing an ethnography of ghettos, for example, but about the historical emergence of minority ghettos as territorialized zones of segregation in mid-20th century Calcutta. Calcutta witnessed two major communal outbreaks in the interwar era in 1918 and 1926. These two riots were confined to an area in northern and central Calcutta. These riots were also confined among the city's prosperous Marwari trading communities and their upcountry, that's how Colonial Archive writes, upcountry Hindu militia on the one hand, and the Muslim working class and petty traders residing in nearby slums and mendicant Kabuli traders, Muslims, on the other. Very rarely did Muslim mobs in these two riots attack Bengali Hindu Bhadralok properties. In fact, occasionally, as historian Suranjan Das pointed out, Hindu workers and basti dealers joined hands with the Muslims in the looting of garment stores and crop warehouses, suggesting definite class animosity at the heart of these riots. A contemporary IB report I found also suggested passive complicity between the Hindu Bengali rentier class and Muslims of central Calcutta in the 1926 riot, as both imagined themselves as losing the city to the Marwaris. From the last decade of the 19th century, this area of the city witnessed massive recycling of space through various municipal initiatives, such as major street schemes, making way for gentrification. In 1911, the colonial authorities set up an expert-managed improvement trust insulated from the fast democratizing municipal corporation, whose street schemes in the central city were deliberately run to the bastis and the streetless neighborhoods to produce a more legible and automobile-friendly urban scale. The violence of planned street and infrastructure building, often associated with a mix of commercial, public health, and counterinsurgency imperatives, valorized urban land as it became one of the prime outlets of capital in Calcutta in the interwar years. The Improvement Trust, which was at the helm of street building, was able to create wealth in Calcutta by means of the development and trading of property. It did so via strategic devaluation and revaluation of asset values at certain junctures in the interwar period. This process unfolded in the separation of the urban poor from their sites of production and social reproduction as quote-unquote congested neighborhoods and bastis in the inner city made way for viable neighborhoods as land in the market. This led to speculation in empty land and gentrification along the axis of class, religious communities, and ethnicity. Simultaneously, dwelling spaces were converted into commercial spaces. Because of speculation, gentrification, and commercialization, a housing crisis arose in the interwar. During these years, that is interwar years, Calcutta also bled into the rural and semi-urban frontiers as the Improvement Trust acquired land and built infrastructures for suburban expansion of the city. Yet the vision of class-based graded dispersal of population from the inner city to the peripheries towards the newly created suburbs failed as land speculation reached these places before the inner city displaced populations could be resettled. Moreover, in the southern frontiers, the urban process faced some hitherto unprecedented obstructions in the form of repeated incidents of organized soil raids by mullahs in particular, legal challenges from substantial property owners refusing compensation packages. One case, for instance, from Rasa Road reached the Privy Council. Allegations of scam between contractors and trust officials, and overall marshy terrain dotted with water bodies requiring considerable mobilization of earth and rubbish from elsewhere. Class and communal tensions made their way through this spatial and demographic churning and produced intermittent communal riots between 1910 and 1926. Often in historiography of communal mobilization, we sort of don't see the local material context, how local forms of communal mobilization take place. In early 20th century Calcutta, religious polarization appeared in a confounding conjunction with the Improvement Trust's street building initiatives. We find that rational action of street building, the invisible hands of the real estate market, and crowd action during communal outbreaks constituted each other in a complex fashion in producing the 20th century city. The territorial outcomes of these riots were mixed. Even though Muslims were in a minority position in central Calcutta during the riots, they continued to receive support and physical enforcement of foot soldiers from the Muslim-dominated industrial belts of the city, especially from the Howrah movement. These forces culminated in a communal civil war in 1946. The civil war enforced the territorial division of the city into a Hindu city and its Muslim ghettos. This is a theme that we shall pursue further in this talk. Hindu-Muslim riot in Calcutta assumed the form of a total warfare between these two communities only in August 1946, known in history as the Great Calcutta Killings, when religious identity of the two warring parties of the parts of the society superseded ethnic, regional, caste, and class identities. It didn't happen before to that extent. The riot of 1946, exceeding its predecessors in all aspects, encompassed the entire city, its suburbs, and the industrial belt. In the third week of August 1946, the violence left about 15,000 dead, 100,000 injured, and 200,000 individuals homeless. Its impact on the city's Muslims was decisive and irreversible. One of the major registers through which the Muslim defeat manifested in subsequent decades was territorial containment. The civil war in August 1946 was a zoning exercise along the communal line, which was reinforced, expanded, and made durable by the subsequent processes of partition and massive migration of the Hindu refugees to the city. This is the point that I wish to establish in the remaining part of my presentation. I wish to document how minority ghettos, as a territorialized form of hyper-visibility and containment, came into being in mid-20th century Calcutta. I do not, however, claim that certain Muslim-dominated areas did not predate these ghettos. During the 1946 Civil War, it was difficult for the police officers working on the ground to mark pockets of the city as exclusively Hindu or Muslim. And I'll establish that. The neighborhoods were mixed even in places where Muslims were in a clear minority in census town. Let me give you an example from the Calcutta Disturbances Inquiry Commission that gathered considerable evidence about the police and military action during the days of the Civil War. N.H. Khundkar was officer in charge of the Bottola police station. You can see the red mark. Okay, so Bottola police station during August 1946. His jurisdiction had only 9% Muslim population as per 1931 census. Khundkar answered as many as 1706 questions during the proceedings of the commission. I'm just quoting a few instances now. What emerges from his deposition is a complex sociology of the Civil War that calls into question existing paradigms of comprehending crowd action. It appears that Khundkar was operating from an epistemic space that was mutually incommensurable with that of the council or the commissioners. They cut the world differently to comprehend the Civil War. Khundkar's thick description, illustrated below, frustrated the commissioners. In the end, there was a crisis of comprehensibility, as the commission's failure to uphold the regime of truth became apparent. So the commissioners ask, can you give us the population of the Hindu and Muslims living in your jurisdiction? Khundkar, Muslims were not more than 9% or a little bit more, but after the disturbances, many Muslims have left the area. Some are selling their houses, some have just fled. Are they spread over the whole area in your jurisdiction, or are they in pockets? Khundkar, they have got basti areas, Muslim pockets here and there. Visibly dissatisfied with this answer, one of the commissioners asks, will you kindly name these pockets in your area? Khundkar, one was in Ramchandra Ghosh Lane, then in Masjid Bari Street. It has got no particular name. This pocket is in Masjid Bari Street. Then to the south of it is Ramchandra Ghosh Lane. Then there is one Muslim pocket there in Central Avenue. There is a mosque that bears a number of Masjid Bari Street. At the crossing of Masjid Bari Street and Central Avenue, there is a mosque, and near it, there are 2 or 3 houses. 3 Muslim families used to live in the rooms attached to the mosque. They have fled during the disturbances. Then Gulu Ostagar Lane, here is also a Muslim pocket, side by side with Hindu residents. There were big buildings and huts here, about 8 houses. Then we come to near about Bidan Row. Here about was a mosque. So note how many mosques here he's talking about, and these are all very working class mosques. Most of them don't exist anymore. Here about was a mosque, and attached to the side of the mosque, there 3 or 4 Muslim families used to live in some rooms attached to the mosque. There were also 2 or 3 huts close by. Then we come to what is called Chidammudi Lane, near about the mosque. Nobody used to live here, but the Mutuwali and 3 or 4 families used to live at this place. This is opposite Bhim Ghosh Lane. Here there were no Muslim residents, but there were 2, 3 or 4 shopkeepers, bidi and cigarette sellers, Muslim shopkeepers. Then here is the police station, and we are on Cornwallis. About this place, there is a mosque. Just north of the police station, Hundkar. Not exactly north, it is northwest. Here we have got a big mansion, thereafter the residence of a Hindu gentleman, then the mosque. By the side of that mosque, in the rooms attached to the mosque, some Kabulis used to reside. Then this is Raja Rajkishan Street, and this is Shahidya Bhushan Street. These are 2 popular streets. Here, there are both Muslims and Hindus. Hindus are more numerous. Between these is Guabagan cattle market. Do any Muslims live there? Hundkar. There are Muslim cattle dealers and some Hindu cattle dealers live mostly this side on Shahidya Bhushan Street, and the north side live Muslims. On the north side of Raja Rajkishan Street, there are some cattle huts, cattle khattals they are called, almost, close to Upper Circular Road. We have Muslims here. Scattered, Hundkar, almost compact around the cattle market, except on the south, where the Hindu cattle dealers live. This, we come to the crossing of Upper Circular Road and Vivekananda Road. This is not exactly opposite the crossing. Here we have a market called Maniktola Market. There is a mosque, and there are few residential huts as well as Muslim shops. Here there was a Hindu shop also. Is that all Muslim area? See the questions. Is that all Muslim area? No, mixed area. Muslims were very few, scattered all over. Here is a basti at number 76 by 1 Cornwallis Street, just west of the police station. This is a mixed area. Was there any Muslim basti behind Ramchandra Ghosh Lane? Ramchand Ghosh Lane? Witness, understanding that the president of the commission had no sense of the place. This is not near Ramchand Ghosh Lane. It is south of that lane and north of Shahidya Bhushan Street. What is important in this long conversation, however, is how Hundkar handled a set of seemingly objective demographic questions regarding how many of which communities live where, by providing more of a visual or pictorial, that is qualitative description. The commission members were trying to fix the population in time and space and ratio. Hundkar, on the other hand, described mobile geographies and entangled realities of intercommunal, interethnic, and interclass sharing of space. Is Fulbagan Basti a Muslim area? Asked a commissioner. The officer replied, there are Mohammedan houses as well as Hindu houses there. A council clarified, also that part between Mitro Lane and Marcus Square is entirely Mohammedan. Hundkar clarifies, no, there are a lot of Hindu houses also. The discussion continued for the whole day on the 14th of August in this circular manner. It was evident that Calcutta's spatio-demographic reality was difficult to zone mark. On several occasions, the councils wanted Hundkar to specify the composition of the crowds. How many Hindus and how many Muslims? Did they belong to the working class or the Bhadralok class? For instance, at one point, Siddiqui, representative of the Muslim League in the commission, asked him to specify the composition of the two mobs. I mean, of what class they were composed. Hundkar's reply was this: of the Muslim mob, some were wearing pajamas, some lungis, and of some Hindus, I saw young men, Bengali young men, Kalwars, and low-class people on both sides. The commission session with Hundkar remained inconclusive for want of a common measure. In other words, they failed to engage satisfactorily with each other's way of seeing the world. Hence, they often talked at cross purposes. Their conversation exposed the conceptual incompatibilities that highlighted the limits of their communication. Khunkar's voice was recorded, but it was hardly heard. By the time Khunkar's affidavit was read, its context had already ebbed away into archival compost. The more the witness, Khunkar, clarified his affidavit, the more it appeared incomprehensible to their lordships. Siddiqui, a representative from the Muslim League in the commission, was inclined to project the comparative innocence and victimhood of the Muslim community of the city. But Khunkar's replies captured the complexity of the violence such that it frustrated any easy conclusion. At one point, Siddiqui asked, I quote, "By this, could you judge the mood of this Hindu mob was very bad?" But Khunkar replied, "The mood was bad on both sides, equally bad." Then Siddiqui anxiously asked Khunkar to give a pocket-by-pocket breakup of the plight of the Muslims where Hindu mobs attacked them. He took up the instance of Masjid Bari Street Basti. "And would you tell us now what happened to these 100 Muslims of Masjid Bari Street?" Khunkar replied, "Nothing happened to them. Not a single Muslim was killed. Not a single Muslim was killed because Hindus protected them." As already discussed, the disturbance of 1946 took on the dimensions of an undeclared civil war. The crowd movement sharpened religious boundaries in space. Its strategic formations through mobile territories claimed the streets while traversing them. In so doing, the crowds dissolved social distinctions to function as a transitory whole. The police clashed the crowds to disperse them into more easily recognizable mobs. The crowds retaliated by chasing the police patrol on escaping from it. The sporadic and disparate mobility of the mob police dyad produced a shifting spatiality in the city. On being pursued by the police, the crowds would disappear and reform a few years further or elsewhere. This continually kept the police patrol on the move in different directions throughout the city, blurring the boundaries of legal jurisdictions of different thanas. However, the boundaries emerged from the civil war did not neatly overlap with the formal boundaries of the police stations. In the dialectic of boundary breaking and boundary preserving exercises, lines continuously moved with the mobile bodies that took the form of a crowd only by breaking and refunctioning these boundaries. Those were the moments at which power and violence intercepted each other on the street, simultaneously instigating and electrifying those who took part in this game. The creation of Pakistan and Calcutta settlement with India, coupled with the disbandment of the Bengal Provincial Muslim League and a spectacular influx of the Hindu refugees in the city, produced material conditions for the ultimate territorial marginalization of the Muslims in Calcutta. Nearly 5 years after the Great Calcutta killing, the census of 1951 published a 50-year trend of the Hindu-Muslim population ratio in Calcutta. The census figures registered a decline of the Muslim population in Calcutta between 1941 and 1951 by 191,000 individuals. The West Bengal government recorded a flight of another 130,000 Muslims by 1951 because of the fear of disturbances. The 1961 census found near elimination of Muslims from select wards of the city and consequent Muslim concentration in some other places like Park Circus, Iqbalpur, Baubazar, Karaya, Narkeldanga, and Beniapur. In this context, it is important to register the change that took place in Hindu-Muslim riots in Calcutta after partitioned independence. There were 3 major outbreaks in 1950, 1964, and 1992. Let us follow the case of 1950 riot to show how the riot scale changed in Calcutta with independence. It's a fundamental change, by the way. In February 1950, a riot broke out in wards 15 and 16, along with areas adjacent to Bidden Street, Amherst Street, and the working class areas of the eastern frontiers of the city. A section of the Congress workers, the RSS, and the Hindu Mahasabha activists were actively involved in this violence. Golwalkar's presence in the Barabazar area of the city on 15th and 16th February was not a mere coincidence. Certain neighborhood clubs in the affected areas were actively engaged in evicting Muslims and settling Hindu refugees in the vacant houses and hutments. Such a case was reported in the Lalbagan area in North Calcutta. In this basti, one Lalbagan Sheba Samiti claimed to have resettled 650 refugee families in 229 vacant houses earlier occupied by Muslim tenants. The Samiti received active encouragement from the Northern District Committee of the Congress Party. A remarkable feature of the violence during the trouble of 1950 was the proliferation of the cases of mob lynching of Muslims inside Muslim mohallas. This is what I'm telling. This is the difference. What is important to note here is its continuous, mundane, and unofficial nature. Many of cases that occurred before the actual carnage of 8th and 10th February 1950, and some continued afterwards. During her investigation, Mridula Sarabhai encountered such a case at Ismail Street in Entally. I quote her, "On or about 8th March, I visited the place. It was quite apparent the persons who were sleeping were attacked. From the way the doors and windows, even the lavatory doors, were broken, one could see the place had been the victim of a concerted attack, and all this in a Muslim mohalla only. Muslims in thousands fled to locations they perceived as safe, as Park Circus, Beniapukur, Narkeldanga, Zakaria Street, Khidirpur." Shekhar Bandyopadhyay says that about 25,000 Muslim refugees were squatting in and around Park Circus Maidan during the riot days. By the third week of March 1950, these refugees were all gone. The British consulate speculated that they had mostly migrated to Pakistan. Some anecdotal evidence I collected during the research also suggests that several Muslim families who had migrated to East Pakistan in 1950 indeed returned to Calcutta within a year or so and began to live in the Muslim-dominated areas of Calcutta. Alam Khan, for instance, left for Pakistan in March 1950 with his family when he was 9 years old. They lived in Calcutta's Bhavanipur previously, a predominantly middle-class Hindu area with a strong Sikh and Marwari presence that witnessed severe communal clashes in 1946. When they returned to Calcutta in 1952 from Dhaka, they sold their Bhavanipur residence and found a place in Darga Road, Park Circus. In the next 1.5 decades, February 1950 became a norm rather than an exception. The cleansing of the Muslim community continued and remained largely unreported in media in the refugee-dominated localities. Jabot Dakhol, or forcible and collective encroachment on public and private property by the Hindu refugees, was a double-edged sword. It was a combination of encroachment as class and encroachment as community. I explain it. It's there in my book. As encroachment as class, it snatched property from the wealthy owners and the state, leading to the fragmentation of capital sunk inland. As a result, the connection between urbanization and capital accumulation, as we found in the interwar era at the behest of the Improvement Trust, collapsed for many years in the post-colonial metropolis in connection with a fledgling competitive electoral politics. If motion refers to capital's expanded self-reproduction, then Jabot Dakhol was a durable obstruction. On the other hand, as encroachment as community, Jabot Dakhol dispossessed and displaced petty Muslim property owners, becoming an electrifying agent of Hinduization of the urban space. it activated a form of spatial mobilization that enabled ghettos to manifest as zones of containment. According to the government's estimate, in 1954, there was at least 2.39 million acres of land under refugee colonization in Calcutta, its adjacent 24 parganas, Howrah, Hooghly, and Nadia. As far as Calcutta was concerned, in early 1960s, Nirmal Kumar Bose found 9 wards in northern, northeastern, eastern, and southern Calcutta where refugee Hindus had totally displaced Muslim laborers, artisans. One direct impact of the sustained communal tension in the 1950s and 1960s was a growing crowding of Muslims of all classes in some of the pockets of the city, especially in southeastern fringes such as Tangra, Tiljala, and Topshia. This is a trend also being noticed by partition historians such as Joya Chatterjee and Ornisha Sengupta. Take the instance of Dhobiatola camp near Dhapa garbage dumping station. Only one report is there by Nagorik Manche. Here, 48 riot-torn Muslim families were stationed in 1964. An estimate of 1992 shows during the riot, 1992 shows that this camp had a population of 5,000 individuals, of which 4,543 were Muslims. Even the middle and upper class Muslims of the city decided to live in these ghettos or close to the ghettos to minimize the risk of communal violence against them. What emerged consequently was communally near uniform, yet class divided and densely populated Muslim neighborhoods. This is where it differs from Islam, which was a distinctly post-colonial phenomenon in Calcutta. Erasure of the general presence of a population group has ironically made certain practices associated with minority communities hyper-visible. The segregated ghetto did not so much mean the end of communal violence as its transformation into other forms and modalities of marginalization and exclusion of religious minority. An outcome of efforts to ward off and escape from large-scale major violence, the Muslim ghetto today marks and underwrites the latent violence of a majoritarian city. Just an anecdote would suffice to prove my point being made here. On 13th January 2020, I visited an Aadhaar registration center in Muslim-dominated Beniapukur in connection with another ethnographic research project. As I entered the premises, I saw a long queue of all age groups, from old ladies to children. I was puzzled since I knew that the area's residents had all completed their Aadhaar formalities already. Fearful of losing out in the identity race set up by Aadhaar, they had enrolled themselves at the very inception of the Aadhaar scheme. Upon investigation, I realized that this was a usual sight in that Aadhaar center. Numerous Muslim citizens came every day to the center to get the spelling of their names corrected. Why? One Jishan told me that in 4 of his crucial identity documents, birth certificate, school certificate, voter ID, and Aadhaar, there were at least 3 versions of his name: J-I-S-H-A-N, Z-I-S-H-A-N, Z-W-S-H-A-N. This ambiguity had caused him many difficulties in all kinds of situations, and he was anxious to put an end to this. An old lady told me that Sarkari officials, predominantly Hindu, regularly found these Muslim names culturally alien to their regular vocabulary. So they imposed what they thought would be the correct spelling of a given name. The second clerk would find it difficult to accept the judgment of his predecessor and would correct the spelling once again in the next document. The cycle goes on. The other registration centers in these neighborhoods never cease to exhaust their utility. These microaggressions have contaminated the Muslim experience. As a result, every Muslim in Calcutta grows up afraid that they are losing out and lagging. It is a strange kind of blackmail where minority citizens must conform to an imposed norm of good citizen behavior. The burden of proof always lies on them. Now I conclude. Unable to take on the Hindus in territorial conflicts like before, minority ghettos attained a durable shape after independence. Simultaneously, majoritarian violence assumed a latent form, always present in urban common sense, in which minority ghettos stood out as obstructions, a potential rupture to normal rhythm of the city and accumulation in real estate. The ghetto can be a prospective site for redevelopment and accumulation, a hitherto underutilized and undercapitalized site. What is needed is just a correct penetration of the land market, which would drive away minority obstructions to the further frontiers of the city. The inevitability of the Muslims, the invisibility of the Muslims in Calcutta's public discourse is, however, compensated by their hyper-visibility in the ghettos. And this invisibility is also due to the fact that partition decimated Muslim middle class. Muslim middle class just fled, right? So what was left was the working class Muslims, mostly. For the Hindu majority and the majoritarian state, the Muslim ghetto represents a site where preparations are always underway for an imaginary battle that would eventually reduce Hindus into a minority. Radical ideas, Kashmiri terrorists, and Pakistani secret service interlopers. Like the migrants, the minorities are destined to be the subjects of a perpetual war. In this majoritarian view, the majority appropriates the tribulations of the minority so that none can escape the specter of the threat of minoritization. A state where both majority and minority mirror each other as minority. Ghettoization via urban planning, communal riots, and jabardakhl was part of urban motion. At the same time, ghettos appeared as obstructions to the normal communalized rhythms of the city. Yet ghettos too have their own motion of life and labor, conditioned by the latent and active violence of the city. Obstruction has its own praxis of motion. People's movements are all about real and everyday motion and mobility. For many of my friends in these ghettos, ghetto is their home, their life world, filled with passion and emotion derived from struggles and suffering of being Muslim in today's India. Motion becomes the aspiration of all, and it is through such a bid to universality that it can aspire toward hegemony. In the interplay of motion and obstruction, the ghetto becomes a unity of opposites and houses an immanent contradiction which asserts itself in the antithetical phases of the city's metamorphosis. We must see how each of these movements engage with the ideology of motion, an ideology that legitimizes a system of domination by masking contradictions. I end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if you sort of end your slideshow, then we can see you.
How do I do that? Top share.
Yeah, there you are. Perfect. Thank you so much. That was also very, very well timed and quite intense. So I will invite questions. I know a lot of people have been wanting to ask questions. All you need to do is raise your hand and I'll call you in. I mean, I know that this is part of your book, but where does it come? I mean, in the scheme of things in your book?
So mostly chapters 2 and 3 and a bit of 4 and part of introduction. So it's a collage of these chapters, basically.
So you've drawn a thematic out of
yeah.
Fascinating.
But mostly 3. Chapter 3 is major in this presentation.
So yeah, I mean, a lot of I'm sure people are still processing everything that was said, but please feel free to raise your hands. And I know Kanu's hand is raised, but I almost feel like it might be by mistake. Kanu, do you want to ask a question? Not sure, because we're all in office, so that's my colleague, and I can see that he's not at his seat right now. So anybody else who wants to jump in? Partho, if you're listening, do you want to jump in? I know you know a lot of people, so you can also just ask someone to jump in if you want to have a conversation.
I don't know whether I have bored everyone.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think it was just a lot to take in. I'm going to call my colleague Partho Mukhopadhyay in.
Of course.
As Mukta says, yes, it's very intense. But I'm just curious about since I stay in that neighborhood, at least my parents used to stay in that neighborhood. To what extent does this whole process of colonization, and it's happened in I'm sort of, I guess people call them assemblage, just a simple mosaic, right? So in around South Kolkata, if you're looking at parts of Naktola, Ganguli Bagan, that area, there is a fair amount of resettlement of Hindus, refugees who have come from Bangladesh. But that resettlement happens in two ways. One, it happens as a result of formal allotment of plots, etc., to particular people, who can show that they have lost property, etc. And then there is the second, which is where large landowners' properties are occupied, and then sort of there are stories about how the Jadavpur University students go out and defend the rights of the refugees against a state action which might want to sort of remove them. And then finally, there is a sort of the secondary market that starts developing in that particular place. And I'm just curious as to whether the nature, how does religion affect the ability of different communities to occupy? Does, for example, do particular groups feel more confident about occupying because they feel that they are in their own land, within their own majoritarian communities, and so on and so forth? Whereas hesitant, and does this sort of lead to different kinds of refugee colonies which sort of emerge? Because you also have this fact that since most of the formal resettlement that is taking place is of Hindus, because they are the ones who have sort of lost their land and have moved into place. So the formal core of these settlements is almost entirely Hindu. And if you think of something coming up around the formal core, does that somehow then lead to a situation where just this interplay of formal and informal and how that sort of provides certain services then leads to a different pattern, the kind of segregation that you were talking about? It sort of emerges through this interplay of formal and informal as it goes forward. I'm just curious as to how you view the sort of mix, sort of this mix of different types of settlements that you currently see in parts of Calcutta, whether it's the Bastis and their property rights, and then there is the formal groups who have purchased, for example, land from landowners who may be Muslim landowners who still retain those rights but have sold it, and maybe even as late as the 50s and the 60s, they sell it to settlers and then move out from there. So I was just curious about how you view that particular phenomenon.
This is a great question. Can I handle it and then move on, or
Yes.
yeah? So this is a great question, and the reply will be this. Let me first talk about the source material to answer your question. Okay, so if you go to the formal archival records, there isn't a lot. You don't have a lot of documentation of displacement within displacement as such. So Hindu refugees coming as an electrifying force, displacing an existing population. If you go to the archives, you will not find a lot of evidence, although there are some scattered references to this. But if you look at the autobiographical reckonings that people collected, a lot of oral historical narratives that have surfaced from 1990s. For example, if you go to partition historians, for example, most notably Nilanjana Chatterjee's thesis, very important thesis on and around Bijoygad, you will find narratives of eviction. For example, how Hindu young men from East Pakistan in early 1950s thought of evicting Muslim as part of their freedom movement. Okay, so Bijoygad is close to Tollygunge, and Tollygunge, if you leave the main area of Tollygunge, then that whole area had a tremendous Muslim population since the time of Tipu Sultan's sons getting resettled there, for instance. So a huge eviction took place in phases in 1950s and 60s, and progressive, so-called progressive forces were in hand in gloves. For example, UCRC and all these refugee movements took active role in evicting Muslims, and there are some Muslim narratives that also exist. For example, those who lived in Bijoygad, for example, earlier, moving to Park Circus, Beniapukur, Karea. So those kinds of things, anecdotal evidence, oral evidence, these kinds of things exist. So if you say two kinds, I would say actually three kinds. One is snatching from the state and corporations, snatching of land by Hindu refugees. Another is, of course, resettlement by the government in long-term lease, etc. Another was, Hindu gangs invading Muslim properties and occupying them. So there were three kinds of things. Now, of course, if you look at refugee migration to from east to west, especially Kolkata, of course, we all know that it hasn't yet stopped. So it's a long partition. We don't talk about a short partition like Punjab, right? So early refugees were predominantly upper caste refugees. Early refugees were predominantly educated upper caste refugees. So when, for example, Dalits started coming, Motuas, Namashudras, when Dalits started coming after 1964 riot, actually 1964 to 71, 81, that was the main time when Dalits came. They were not able to find a lot of foray into these refugee areas, for example, that upper caste refugees occupied. So, of course, there is a very strong caste dimension to the whole story as well, because upper castes were landowning as well. So they lost their land before Dalits, for example, and they were targeted by the Muslims in East Pakistan much before. So when they came, they also occupied the political space to a great extent. And Calcutta didn't only become a Hindu city, it also became a Bengali city because of partition, and it also became an upper caste city. Actually, there was a silent upper caste vote bank that developed. So nowhere in India did it happen that you have a substantial upper caste vote bank because of the refugees, right? Because they were also given the electoral role, right? So I would say that, of course, the question is very important: who could access what? And I would say that, upper caste refugees were the main people who orchestrated both encroachment as class and encroachment as community. And encroachment as class meant encroachment as community and vice versa. So that's why I said Jabardakhl is a double-edged sword.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Partho. Did you have a follow-on question? We have a very, very silent set of attendees today, which I'm very surprised by, because there are lots of people who can.
Ritajyoti is sort of bringing forth uncomfortable descriptions about our cities, because most of us don't delve into these kinds of structures, and that I think is forcing people to think through what they want to ask. So I think that's a good outcome to have. So no, I think the
thoughtful silence.
Yeah, the issue of caste, I think, is also important in the context of the fact that even among the left parties of Bengal, its leadership has historically been among the upper caste, and so there is that tension that where you are in some sense representing the working class, and yet you have this. So what is the class caste story in these areas then becomes much more important. So no, I don't have anything a follow on except for the fact that there is this broad area that we don't sort of often dig up, and it's good to see it getting some discussion and play.
Thank you, Professor, for telling about.
Yeah, I guess from an urban studies point of view, I mean, for people like me who come in from a more planning perspective, and then we hear this very, rich historical kind of account, and you think about how these histories are very specific to place. And yet, these kind of larger questions of segregation or discrimination or violence are being asked in many different places. So for me, that's really interesting, because what you're describing is obviously very, very specific to Kolkata. And yet, a Delhi and a Bombay and an Ahmedabad will have their own very, very unique histories. And today, when you look at it, some things may seem similar, but they've all arrived here through very different processes. Yes, so that's what's interesting to me. But let me invite Shagun in. Shagun, I'm just going to, you can come in and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm going to basically springboard off a comment that Muktanak made just now. So I studied Delhi, and I see a lot of parallels between what you just described and sort of what I've been working on as part of my doctoral work. Something that really struck me I've read about your work a little bit in Societies in Space recently as well. Something that really struck me is this concept of urban warfare that you brought forth by making the street sort of the one of the focal elements of your analysis. And I was thinking, of course, in Delhi, the anti-CAA protests and, the protests against the new farm bills sort of reposition the city's availability as that sort of space to conduct urban warfare of a certain sort. And so because your work relies a lot on sort of the historical archive, but a lot of these things continue to play out in real time, the juxtaposition is very interesting of how history relates to the present. And I was therefore just sort of springing from that question and that comment that Mukta just made. What do you perceive this relationship between history and the present to be? Like what you found in the archive, or what you didn't find, and what you had to take from the present moment to sort of build this narrative that you have?
Oh, that's a great question, Shagun. I would also try to familiarize.
Do you want to answer them one by one, or should we cluster them now that they're coming thick and fast?
Okay.
No, I mean, it's up to you, because it's
No, if there are questions,
for
I'll be happy to.
Yeah. So I'll just ask Shamal in as well. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm from Ahmedabad. I've never visited Kolkata, so won't be able to comment on how relevant the whole explanation was. But I hope we find some author like you in Ahmedabad that can do some same kind of study.
Okay. Did you have a question as well, or
No question. Never been to Calcutta, so no point of asking the question. I don't know the geography of Calcutta. But
okay, no,
it was very interesting, very interesting.
Thank you so much, Shamal. Lakshya, you've already put a question in the Q&A, but maybe you can articulate it yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Bandhupadhyay. It's been a long time since I met him, and
Yes.
I
remember.
Yeah. So it was a pleasure reading the article and also listening to your talk. I think I was going through somewhere, I think it was an article on Sahapi or somewhere, which sort of, talked about this politics of refugee colonies in Calcutta. And though I've not been much familiar with the sort of the geography of the city, I've been there a few times. But they were referring to something called the United Refugee sort of
UCRC.
Council. Yeah, UCRC, which came, and that sort of played a very important role in collectivizing and affirming their sort of presence and claiming the rights of the refugees and blah blah, and which also had some relationship with the Popular Left Front in Bengal. So I wanted you to speak on that, because I'm coming from a perspective as to I'm also looking at politics of refugees in cities currently in Delhi, right, and on other area where Rohingyas and others have been sort of pushed outside, and we sort of mostly think that bringing them together or making their collectives will help, or some sort of relationship like that. But how would we see collectives playing a role in that? Of maybe if they're upper class, people coming together, forming this kind of council or whatever. So would want your views on that, and also if you can explore, elaborate more on that. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. I think
Okay.
that's for now. Yeah.
Okay, so I start with Lakshya. The article you were talking about in Sahapedia was by Annesha Sengupta, and she also took a long interview of my interview. So they're tagged together. So yes, there she talks about UCRC, you are right. I can certainly give you a few important names. For example, Prafullo Chakraborty's very well documented book called Marginal Men has a very detailed documentation of the refugee movement, for example. And if you want a more updated, more, more sophisticated account of, in today's diction, sophisticated account of the same, then you get Uditi Sen's very, very interesting work called Citizen Refugees. So, of course, you can look at these things, but yes, refugee movement, upper caste refugee movement in Kolkata played a very important role in two areas, actually. One, as Professor Parthu Mukhopadhyay was talking about, one is, of course, in electoral politics and left politics. So if you look at the state-wise leadership in West Bengal after independence of both Congress and BJP, now BJP comes by default, both Congress and CPI, you will see that district leadership of the West Bengal was thoroughly marginalized. They were in districts. Nobody very prominently from the districts came and occupied the hegemonic position in the party in Calcutta, for example. Right? So refugees, like Jyoti Basu, for example, came from East Bengal. So East Bengalis and refugees. played a very significant role in formal West Bengal politics. And another domain where they played a very significant role is culture industry. Okay, so all the big filmmakers, all the big musicians that came in the 1950s and 1960s, they had either a refugee past or at least an East Bengali past. Not every East Bengali was a refugee. So the thing is that they played a very significant role. And what astonishes me even now, and it's a cultural question, and is that so much, 4 million people colonizing a city, expanding the city in a very different manner than it was established and expanded. And you don't see a lot of ethnic trouble, a lot of infightings between West Bengalis and East Bengalis. It happened in cultural slurs, it happened via Mohun Bagan East Bengal football match, it happened in various ways, but it didn't take the form that took in Lebanon. And there, I think your question makes a lot of sense. Two person, my friend from Gujarat, actually, Christophe Jeffrey Lowe has done some work on a very similar direction. So probably you will like to see Jeff Lowe's and his students who worked around in Gujarat. So some literature on Gujarat, similar literature on Gujarat also exists. Now the question that Shogun put, I really liked it. So warfare is actually very, very central. War is politics by other means, and politics is war by other means. So basically, Foucault always plays a very significant role in my way of formulating the city. So optic of war in motion obstruction dialectic is very, very central in my book as such. So what I'm trying to say is that, you must have noticed that there is a difference between 1946 civil war and 1950 riot. And why I established the point? Why? Because of the fate of the Muslims due to partition. They became a minority, a significant minority, losing all their territory. They were territorial minorities, but they became a structural minority because they lost their middle class, discourse-making class. There was no discourse-making class available for the Muslims. Dalits acquired a discourse-making class due to reservation, but Muslims couldn't. So they became, from a territorial minority, they became a structural minority. So the question is that since then, since 1950 riot is very significant to me, because that was for the first time I see organized lynching without any response from the other side, which has become modular in Modi. I also say up chronology samjhiye, because that happens after partition, not before partition. As Amit Shah said, chronology samjhiye. So basically chronology samajhna both important hota hai. So the thing is that what I'm trying to say is that, from the if you ask the question of the present, for example, what you see in Delhi riots, for example, it's increasing ghettoization, increasing eviction of Muslims from certain neighborhoods, bringing real estate players with bulldozer. Why bulldozer? Because bulldozer mediates between warfare, state, and real estate. So bulldozer is very important, very significant. Bulldozer is a great metaphor of motion. In my motion obstruction dialectic, think of it, bulldozer. Right? So why does Jogi have to bring 2 bulldozers during? Because it's the ideology of motion, right? That Jogi wants to represent. That any ghetto obstruction would be eliminated. Ghetto is an obstruction. So Yes, warfare is on, but this warfare is a one-sided warfare. It's a warfare of cleansing. It's not a warfare where decision is pending. Decision is already done. Outcome is already known. Right? We all know the outcome. What will the bulldozer do at the end of the day? But there was unpredictability till 1946 in Indian cities. Certain Indian cities, certainly. Right? There was unpredictability. Territorial outcomes were not very well known. And that's why, as I pointed out through the Thana OC's deposition, that, even in a Thana where you have just 9% Muslim population, how incredibly complicated is the arrangement, demographic arrangement between Hindus and Muslims. That thing you will not see anymore. That thing you will not see anymore in Calcutta. And also remember that in Calcutta was never ruled by a Hindu majoritarian party as such. Right? Although Calcutta spearheaded all forms of Hindutva, we tend to forget, we give it to Maharashtra and Gujarat, but Calcutta spearheaded a lot of Hindutva. But remember that Calcutta was never governed by a non-secular so-called party. Still, this is the situation. In Calcutta, majoritarianism is always very latent, and that is its power and structural. So I would say that in every city, when war is over, war is won, the majority begins to think of itself as a permanent minority. What will you do? When you say Hindu khatre mein hai, what does it mean? That majority community believes that they are the actual minority. So they don't have any optic to see themselves. The optic, the image is that of the minority. So minority is a minority and majority is also a minority. Majority is so unstable in that sense. Right? So that is what I tried to pinpoint in my conclusion as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you. More questions? It is a, I mean, this, especially the answer to this question is quite, I think, quite a commentary on the present as much as it is drawing on your historical work. So I can imagine that a lot of people are trying to process how to sort of relate it to the work that they do, but please do ask questions. I mean, that's why this workshop is for us to have a frank discussion and to be able to,
And for me to write more.
Yes, of course, that too. So yeah, anybody? Gopa, do you have something? I mean, I'm just calling out names because of people I know. Kanchan, do you want to pop in and say hi? Nilanjan, anything specific from your observations on Kolkata and your field work there? I can bring you in, you just need to sort of raise your hand or leave a comment or a Q&A question or something like that. Okay, Gopa is here. 1 second, Gopa, I'll just call you in.
Okay, Gopa.
Hi, it's really good to listen to it.
I can't hear you properly. Come
Yeah?
closer to the mic.
Okay, I'll just try. Is that okay now?
I think so. Ask.
Yeah, it's better.
So actually, I never worked on Calcutta. You know that very well. But I was trying to relate my study from the other side. Like when you mentioned that there is always an upper caste refugees who took hold of the city. And I was relating this observation with my observation from the work of the Chor, the Bengal Bangladeshi refugees living in the chors of Damodar River. And they always used to tell me this story, because they said that they left Bangladesh afterwards. They are all Namasudras and Dalits, and they could not get access the shelter anywhere in
Exactly.
Calcutta.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's why they were landed up in refugee center, like, Mankor in Bardhaman or somewhere else, from where they had to go to Dandakarana. They escaped and they tried to come to the chores, thinking that it's a safer place for them. So when you are saying this from the other side, I can completely relate with this thing. And I also, from my own experience, a personal experience of living in this state for so long time, I don't disagree with you if you say that, one kind of Hindutva has played a role, even if we have secular governments. We actually said that there is no caste, but that was a damn lie, because I was growing up in a village in Bankura district, and I always lived in Bardhaman, a small city, so I know. And today, one of my students was saying that they are Dalits. They are 30 kilometers away from Bardhaman town, and in that village, the puja, when there is a yearly puja thing, and the lower caste, these ACs, they don't get access to the main temple, so they do the puja on the outside the temple, in the premise. So I don't disagree with you when you claim these things in your.
Thank you, Gopadi. I think you made a very correct point, because refugees tried to enter in the city, and that's when, that's when the absolute intolerance of the left was revealed as well. So Morichapi happened. So when, for example, refugees started walking from Dandakarana via the rail line, they were walking in a procession. They reached Sundarbans, and you know what happened. That was the first organized carnage by this earlier dispensation. But the thing is that, you were absolutely right. Calcutta was produced as an upper caste city, upper caste Bengali city, post deindustrialization, post freight rationalization, post deindustrialization, post the flight of the British. Calcutta was consciously constructed as not just a Bengali city, but also an upper caste city. So that's why when you talk about Bengal exceptionalism in politics, why upper caste hegemony is never challenged in Bengal to the extent that it happened in other states. Remember that Punjab and Bengal are the two states where you have the highest percentage of Dalit population, right? Punjab and Bengal. Why? It's because of partition. It's because of partition, nothing else. Because of partition. It's way above the national standard and average. And yet you don't have Dalit assertion here. Ashidam had to move from Punjab to UP to do his politics, right? So the thing is that, in Bengal, the hegemony of the Bhadralok class was established because of their claim to urban land. Cities land. That is the larger point I made. So I just wanted to compliment you on this. We don't have any disagreements. We compliment, right?
Yeah, so Lakshya is pointing out the similarities with Delhi and the difference between CR Park and other refugee settlements, which were bastis and so on. So I'm bringing in Pushpa to ask her question next. Pushpa, go ahead.
Hi, I am following up from the previous question on Delhi by the previous speaker. One major difference, and that is that there was a Ministry of Rehabilitation set up in post-partition, particularly to settle refugees that came from outside India, both East and West Pakistan. So in Delhi, the resettlement process was very systematic. As
Pushpa, I lost you.
for example, I was also sorry.
Pushpa, can you just go back and repeat? I think we lost you for just a few seconds.
Yeah, my internet is today very bad because of the cloudy season. I said I'm struck by the difference in the way the refugees settled in Delhi versus Kolkata. In Delhi, the resettlement process was very systematic, and land was given in exchange of land That is the size of land and property you had in Pakistan, and then land was allocated. So why in Calcutta, the refugees that came from East Pakistan encroached on land rather than they were settled in a rightful manner? So this is a question that comes to my mind, whereas the governance framework was the same in Delhi and Kolkata.
Okay, can I respond to this question?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
a
yeah.
very important question. So, okay, so see that, thank you for asking this question. So I also mentioned in my talk that Punjab and Bengal were divided very differently. For example, in Punjab, what happened, there was also a kind of total population exchange. Almost. Okay, so when property exchange happened, evacuee property exchange happened, so there was a very important ICS officer called Randhawa in Punjab, who was in charge of the refugee land allotment. So as you exactly pointed out, in the West till Delhi, actually this is the thing, for properties were exchanged between villages came and settled, for example. Village to village transfer happened. But in East, it was much more messy. It was a messy partition. One reason is also the topography. Topography is very important. It's an active delta, India, Bangladesh. Rivers change their course and all these things. The border is much more messier than what you have in West, for example, right? So this is one. And secondly, migration from Eastern Bengal to Calcutta has a very long history, because Calcutta is the nerve center, had been the nerve center of the empire, for example. So long history, and it never ceased after partition as well. So, and Muslims did not leave. Only the elite Muslims left. Working class Muslims who left, for example, I gave you some statistics, who left came back. I told you Alam Khan's story. For example, they came back. Yes. Working class Muslims came back. So it was a to and fro that continued for at least 3 decades. In Punjab, it was a one time, one space phenomenon. It was spectacular. It was bloody. It was spectacular, but it has a 6-month duration. Then things settled. Punjab didn't need to do land reforms. Green revolution happened in Punjab area because of the size of the land allotment during partition. So land reform history is very different in Punjab. For example, you have 2 floors of evacuee property records in Chandigarh archives, and nobody knows actually their state. It's in Parah, basically. Lot of work needs to be done. So the thing is, the thing is that in Calcutta, the eastern part, partition was a process, not an event. Partition was a process. So it continued. That's why no plan worked. Nothing worked. The only thing that worked for partition for India was the ability for Indian government to industrialize during the second plan period, because you got low-waged workers as refugees. If you go and check Durgapur, if you go and check Bokaro, if you look at their rosters, you'll find so many refugee names coming out, right? So industrial revolution of second plan period, Mahalanobis Nehru, that time, it's actually the demographic thing. So I always call partition as primitive accumulation. Right?
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. I didn't think about it like this before. But does opposition to partition, which was much more significant in Bengal, also played a role, that there was no willingness to accept systematic resettlement? Was that also a factor?
Systematic resettlement from the government?
No, people. Because there was opposition to partition itself. Bengal partition wasn't easy.
Shama Prasad
So
Mukherjee, Shama
was
Prasad
it a
Mukherjee-
factor in this messy
Maybe.
process that went on for
Maybe.
years?
Maybe I didn't think it in these terms, but maybe because opposition to partition was very, very significant in the
Yes,
eastern border. And
Yes.
also the bordering that happened between east and west was, as I said, was extremely messy. So one part of the house went into Pakistan, eastern Pakistan. One part remained here. And you have Bengali speaking population at the end of the day. So a lot of messy things happened during that period. And initial years, so for example, Namashudras were not known for land entitlement, land ownership in Eastern Bengal. Land owning class and caste was the upper caste people. So they were first targeted. It was a class affair when the first riots happened, 1946-47. And it continued. So the first generation was all, educated refugees. That's why you will see that, 20 years after partition, if you go to these colonies, Partha Mukhopadhyay will know very well, because I think he's from Navadvip, so Navadvip also has these settlements. So surrounding areas. So the thing is that 20 years since partition, people had spectacular social mobility. Spectacular social mobility. Because you are landless, you have nothing, you are in a state of begging, but you know a postmaster, you know a schoolmaster from your extended clan. So you will share clothes, you will share textbooks. Dalits did not have that kind of a social network. So I have known many hawkers. My 5th chapter is on hawkers. You can check that. There is a huge discussion on this caste dimension of street vending, for example. So Dalits could not move up. But in 20 years, upper caste hawkers moved up in the ladder. One brother got a job in bank. Another brother got a job in a school, right? So there was a middle class formation that happened in 20 years down the line. So the Muslim question, the minority question is tied with this. Reservation was not extended.
Yes. But I'm also looking at land settlement not as agricultural land settlement, but house for house. For example, if you had a hut somewhere, you got a similar to hut settlement in Kalkaji, small places, and you didn't get a place in Jangpura and Nizamuddin. So house for house, property for property, very systematically the Ministry of Rehabilitation, I have read accounts of it because I have worked on Delhi. I haven't written, but this part of Delhi's growth is very well documented. They documented the house for house, property for property, and they tried to give you equal property. So even if somebody had a hut who was Dalit, who didn't have agricultural land, would be qualified to get a small EWS type allocation. But so why did that not happen in Bengal?
So one answer, probable answer, is that also remember that Calcutta was a permanent settlement city. So municipal corporation, the state, and all other corporations were land anemic. In Delhi, the situation was, I assume, I am not a Delhi specialist, but I assume that Delhi still has huge corpus of land associated with all governmental bodies, right? But in Calcutta, from the very beginning of Calcutta Improvement Trust, this was the discussion that Calcutta is unlike Bombay. Calcutta is a permanent settlement city, and any acquisition of land becomes a case in the court, right? So,
sorry. So no land was acquired. New land was allocated, and that's why Delhi expanded. And not only Delhi, the refugees were sent to Western UP, to Tarai region. It was an all India phenomena. It was not only Delhi. It was done by the Ministry of Rehabilitation. It was all India. So why they did not have a reach in Bengal is a question, I think, perhaps
No,
you
no,
need
so
to,
what
I don't
person?
have an answer.
No, no, it is what pursuing. These are all probable speculation.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, thank you anyway.
Lakshay, you can speak because you've put in a
Yeah.
comment to response to this. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Mukta. So I think now this gives me the feel of our in-person workshops that we used to have with Pushpa speaking and sharing her experience. I think, what you hinted lastly is what I wanted to point out is also because, Delhi represented the kind of modern capital of independent India. And the kind of transformation of DIT into DDA, and then the subsequent sort of grabbing of land from a lot of Delhi villages was one of the reasons that it was done. But also the naming. I mean, if you look at Malvi Nagar and all the nagars that came up, had a very tendency of showing very upper caste names, and all the names if you see in Delhi which came up, all the refugee colonies which quote unquote have different names. CR Park name was also changed later. And this politics of grabbing was equally functioned. Like even if you look at the history of Kalibadi, which is near JNU, that land was because a lot of Bengali bureaucrats who were in sort of good positions, that land did belong to DDA and it was acquired and Kalibadi was made and then subsequently was transferred to the trust. So it did play. And even when Pushpa is saying it was done systematically, a lot of the refugees in 71 were housed in Tarai, which is my hometown, in the Tarai belt. They were using transit camps, as they were called, right? Those transit camps still remains and they are much like a ghetto space, mostly housed by Bengalis. But, so it was like the upper caste Bengalis would have got a home in Delhi, but the lower caste Bengali was pushed to Tarai, which was quite inhabitable. So if you read Tarai Improvement Trust report and all that, there was a scheme by Britishers called Tarai Rehabilitation Scheme or Tarai Colonization Scheme, in which the whole Tarai was planned to be allocated, and subsequently government India kind of gave this housing to a lot of refugees in 50s and then later in 71 to Bengalis. Some of them got it, but some of them stayed back in these transit camps. And you find a number of transit camps in towns made in Tarai exclusively for Bengali migrants, mostly who were Dalits and belonging to. So it was. So I think the much more systematic, as we are calling in Delhi, had a very peculiar sort of Hindu and caste angle to it. But it was not that systematically in other regions where a lot of the refugees or quote unquote these people were pushed into. And I mean, these conditions have remained same. I mean, I can speak definitely for Tarai because I did some work on it and being exploring that angle, but it has not been systematically that much in Tarai, I know. Yeah, so that was it.
Fascinating. Thank you, Laksh, for that intervention. We don't have any more questions, but this is really thrown up a lot of new stuff. Don't you agree, Jyoti? I mean, what,
Yes,
did you expect this turn of?
After a long time, I feel very energized actually, because this is my second talk on the book, and only so it's very good.
This is great. So, I mean, any last closing words from your end? Because, I mean, we're sort of thinning down on the crowd and
Yes,
many more questions.
I'm really happy, and I wish to be a part of this conversation even further times. Where I've taken the thing further. I've registered myself with your announcements, so
that is
I'll
great.
Part.
That is great. So we have all kinds of people from all sorts of disciplines talking about cities and urbanization and urban processes every month. So and and invite everyone else who is here for the first time to sort of register with the CPR sign up on our website, and you'll get the information from us. Thank you so much, Jyoti, for making time, for answering patiently, and for everyone who participated and contributed their knowledge. And we hope to have many more such discussions going forward. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.